Do you believe people can really change? Or do they just get better at hiding things?
Christmas isn't for failures, my brother Kyle said, swirling a half-full glass of wine with that smug little wrist flick he picked up after too many nights watching business podcasts he never understood. The room didn't go silent, no one gasped, no one dropped their forks, but I felt the shift. It was like being elbowed in the ribs during a family photo, right when the camera flashes and you're the only one mid-blink. I was standing there with a homemade pie in my hands, the same damn recipe Mom's been asking me to bring for the past 15 years, and suddenly I wasn't welcome anymore. Not just unwelcome, but uninvited. Discarded. Like a dish someone brings to dinner that nobody touches and quietly ends up in the trash after everyone leaves. I didn't say anything. That was my mistake, maybe. I just nodded like some kind of fool, placed the pie carefully on the granite counter, next to Karen's dry-as-dust green bean casserole, and walked back through the buzz of conversation that no longer included me. My mom didn't turn around when I left. My father didn't even notice. The kids were running around screaming about presents and peppermint bark and some YouTuber's Christmas giveaway. I let the front door close quietly behind me, walked past Kyle's pickup parked sideways in the driveway like it owned the place, and drove the 40 minutes back to my house with my jaw clenched and my heart pounding harder with every passing mile. I didn't cry on the way home. That surprised me. I think something inside me had finally calcified after all these years of being the family's invisible scaffolding, the thing that holds everyone up but never gets seen or thanked. When I got home, I didn't even take my coat off. I poured myself a glass of Cabernet, the good kind I save for company I never invite, and sat at the kitchen table in the glow of a single overhead bulb. I opened my laptop, clicked through my banking app, and stared at the long list of transactions that told a very different story than the one my family believed. You see, Kyle hasn't worked a full-time job since before the pandemic. That's not an exaggeration. His last steady gig was some middle management role at a logistics company he got through a college buddy, and when that fell through, he bounced around consulting and contract work, which was really code for me wiring him money every time their fridge broke or the kids needed clothes. Kyle and Karen always had some story. Daycare costs went up, the car needed tires, the mortgage rate adjusted and hit them harder than expected. I stepped in like I always do, quietly, discreetly, without ever throwing it in their faces. That's what family does, right? We absorb the burdens. We carry the weight. We shut up and smile and bring the damn pie. So that night, I went line by line through my accounts. Their mortgage? It's been in my name since 2019, after they almost lost the house and Mom begged me to help. I co-signed the refinance and agreed to cover the payment for a few months. That few months turned into 4 years. Their car loan? Same story. Their internet bill, their electric bill, even Kyle's past due credit cards that I quietly paid off when he forgot and almost wrecked their credit, I handled all of it. Not once did I ask for thanks. Not once did I use it to guilt him into being nicer or treating me with basic respect. I just assumed, foolishly, that someday it would be repaid in kindness. Or at least dignity. But apparently, when your little brother drinks 2 glasses of wine and feels bold, all that fades, and you become the failure who doesn't need to be around on Christmas. I spent the next hour shutting it all down. I logged into the bank that holds the mortgage and stopped the autopay. I pulled my name off the car loan authorization. I called the credit card company and revoked my backup user permissions. I emailed the electric company and removed my credit card from the billing profile. With each click, each confirmation screen, I felt the pressure in my chest ease just a little. Not joy, not revenge. Just release. Like setting down a bag you didn't realize had been breaking your spine one vertebra at a time. I didn't tell them. I didn't call, text, or send a passive-aggressive email. I didn't even block them. I just let go. 3 days later, the calls started. First it was Kyle. Missed call. No voicemail. Then again. Still nothing. Then Karen. A voicemail this time, her voice tight, strained, still trying to sound chipper. Hey Rachel, not sure if something's wrong with the bank, but our mortgage payment didn't go through this month. Kyle's trying to call you. Can you let us know what's going on? Hope everything's okay. I didn't answer. That afternoon, a second voicemail came through from her, less cheerful, more urgent. Rachel, we really need to talk. The gas bill was declined and they're threatening shut-off. I know you've helped with this stuff before, and I swear we'll pay you back. Just please, call me. But it was the third voicemail, the one she didn't know she left, that made my skin prickle. I listened to it twice. Karen must have thought she hung up, but the message kept recording. I heard her speaking low, probably in another room, her voice cracking like it used to when she and Kyle fought in their tiny apartment before the house, before the kids. I told you not to piss her off, Kyle. She warned you last year. I told you she'd walk away if you kept pushing her. That was the moment it hit me. They knew. They always knew. They just didn't think I'd actually do it. And now? Now I finally had something they couldn't touch. Silence. No more wires. No more favors. No more late-night emergencies or Christmas invitations that came with side eyes and whispered jokes. Let them sit in their house of cards. Let them feel the cold. This time, I wasn't coming back. But I wasn't finished either. Because for once in my life, I wanted Kyle to feel what it meant to lose something that couldn't be bought back with a phone call or a promise. And the best part? I wasn't even close to done. There's something disturbingly liberating about watching people squirm in a situation they crafted with their own arrogance, especially when you've spent years biting your tongue while quietly underwriting their lifestyle like some invisible, overworked banker who never even gets a Christmas card. After I cut the financial cord and let the digital wheels grind to a halt, I spent that first week in a strange sort of calm, one part grim satisfaction, one part deep, aching sadness. Not sadness for them, no. For me. For how long I'd allowed this dynamic to go on, unchecked, unchallenged, and how long I let my fear of being labeled cold or selfish override the reality that I was being used, emotionally and financially, by the very people who now seem stunned that their invisible support beam had finally collapsed. People like Kyle, and maybe families like mine in general, have a way of constructing narratives that suit their comfort. He was always the charming one, the baby of the family, the one who got away with skipping homework and still ended up praised for trying hard. When we were kids, I used to do his book reports while he played video games, and when Mom found out once, she scolded me for enabling him, but still let him go to the movies that night. That was the story of our life. I was the one who cleaned up, paid up, showed up. He was the one who got away with it. And the irony was I let it continue long into adulthood because somewhere deep down I believed I was supposed to, that family was about loyalty, and loyalty meant sacrifice, even when it became absurd. But now that the safety net was gone, it was as if someone had turned on a light in a house I never realized was covered in mold. My phone lit up daily with new messages from Karen, each one more urgent, more pleading, more wrapped in barely disguised manipulation. The kids are scared, Rachel, she said in one voicemail, her voice cracking like someone who just realized she married a man with charm but no spine. They don't understand why the power's off. We didn't do anything to you. And that's what stuck with me, though we didn't do anything to you. As if I was punishing them for a crime they couldn't even see. That was the problem. They never saw it. They never saw me. So let's talk about money. Not in some cold, numbers on a spreadsheet way, but in the way that matters. In the way that slowly erodes your self-worth when you're the one picking up the pieces over and over again. I ran the numbers that week, not out of spite, but because I needed to finally stare it in the face. Since 2019, I'd sent Kyle and Karen just under $98,000. It started small, $200 here, $500 there. Then came the mortgage crisis, where Kyle called me crying in his car, ashamed but out of options, and I jumped in like I always did. I took out a personal loan to help cover their closing costs on the refinance, thinking it would be a one-time thing. Spoiler, it wasn't. Then came the car, Karen's SUV, that broke down in the middle of winter, stranding her and the kids on the side of the road. Kyle called me frantic, and I wired them $3,000 that night. No one asked if I had it. No one cared if I was juggling my own expenses or sacrificing a vacation I hadn't taken in 6 years. I was single, after all. No husband, no kids, no real obligations, just a stable job and a history of reliability. And in their eyes, that made me the family bank. But the real gut punch came when I added up the groceries, the holiday help, the quiet Venmo transfers for school supplies and soccer fees and summer camp deposits. I funded their life while they made me feel like an afterthought, a pitiful spinster aunt who didn't know when to shut up and just be grateful to be included. So when Kyle finally worked up the courage to text me, not call, of course, because that would require the decency of voice, I read the message slowly, twice over. Hey Ratch. Not sure what's going on, but Karen says the mortgage got messed up and the power's been off for a day. If you could just handle it for this month, I'll pay you back. Promise. No apology. No acknowledgement of the Christmas comment. Just a casual ask for another lifeline, like it was no different than asking for a ride to the airport. I didn't reply. 2 days later, he texted again. Seriously, Rachel. You can't just disappear. This is your family. What are we supposed to do? I nearly laughed. The irony was too rich. Disappear? I had been invisible for years, just a warm body who showed up with food and money and left without making waves. And now, suddenly, my absence was unbearable. That's when I made a decision, not out of vengeance, but out of clarity. I drafted an email. Long, meticulous, unsparing. It began like this. Dear Kyle, you once said Christmas wasn't for failures. I agree. Which is why I'm choosing not to participate in our family's tradition of emotional blackmail, financial dependency, and selective amnesia. For 4 years, I've paid your bills, shielded your pride, and allowed myself to be erased in the process. That ends now. I itemized everything. Every dollar. Every loan. Every quiet rescue. And at the end, I included a line that I knew would hit harder than any insult. From now on, if you need help, I suggest you talk to a bank. I no longer do favors without interest. I hit send and closed the laptop. The silence that followed wasn't peaceful, but it was honest. I'd finally drawn the line that should have been drawn years ago. And just when I thought maybe that would be it, maybe they'd get the message and figure out how to stand on their own, I got a knock at my door. Not a call. Not a text. An actual knock. When I opened it, Karen was standing there. Her face was red, her makeup smeared, and her voice cracked when she spoke. You don't understand, Rachel. It's not just about the money. She looked like she'd seen a ghost. And I knew right then that something else was going on, something Kyle hadn't told me. Standing in that doorway, facing Karen with her coat unbuttoned and her breath fogging in the cold, I saw something I hadn't seen in her in years, maybe ever. Not just panic, not just the usual performative distress she conjured when bills were due or Kyle was too proud to pick up the phone, but something much heavier, something that looked a lot more like genuine fear than inconvenience. Her hands were shaking, not from the weather, though it was bitter enough that evening to warrant gloves, but from the weight of whatever truth she'd come to finally speak out loud, and for a few seconds I simply stared at her, not out of spite, but because I was trying to determine whether I was about to hear another variation of the same old tune or if, for the first time, she was about to tell me something real. She didn't wait for an invitation. She just stepped inside like someone who knew there was no other place left to go, and before I could even offer her a seat or take her coat, she blurted out, Rachel, I swear I didn't know what he said to you at Christmas until afterward. I never would have let him do that if I'd heard it in the moment. I would have said something. Her voice cracked mid-sentence, and I could tell she'd probably rehearsed the apology in the car, over and over again, praying I'd at least open the door long enough for her to deliver it. But I said nothing. I let her speak because I wanted to see what else was coming. And what came next wasn't something I expected, not in that moment, not even after everything I'd learned about how far Kyle would go to keep up appearances. Karen sat down at the edge of my couch, like someone afraid to leave a wrinkle in the cushions, and began unraveling a version of events that cast my brother in a far darker light than even I had imagined. She told me how, over the past year, Kyle hadn't just been struggling financially, but had spiraled into something closer to self-destruction, drinking more than usual, lying about freelance income, pretending to interview for jobs that didn't exist, and even borrowing money from people outside the family, promising that his sister would square it away. That last part made my stomach tighten. Apparently, I wasn't just the one silently paying the bills. I had become his collateral, a name he used when bluffing through debts he had no means of settling. When she told me there was at least one payday loan in my name that he had somehow applied for using a copied piece of old paperwork I'd sent years ago, back when I co-signed their first car loan, I felt a pulse of heat flash up my neck and into my jaw. My ears started ringing. I remember standing perfectly still, my arms crossed so tight my fingernails left half-moon marks on my skin, and the only thought I could process was how thoroughly I'd been manipulated. Not just lied to, not just used, but turned into a financial ghost who existed solely to buy Kyle time he didn't deserve. Karen, to her credit, didn't try to soften the blow. She cried, yes, but she didn't excuse him. She didn't beg for forgiveness on his behalf. She simply said what she should have said years ago. I should have told you sooner. I kept thinking he'd fix it before it got out of control. And when it didn't, I felt like I had to keep the lie going, because what was I going to do? Tell you the man you've been saving was actually sinking you too. And then she said something I don't think I'll ever forget. He's terrified of you now, Rachel. Not because you cut the money off, but because he knows that if you tell the rest of the family what's really been going on, he won't just look irresponsible. He'll look like a fraud. That hit me harder than I expected. Because it was true. If I wanted to, I could have forwarded the documents, the emails, the screenshots of transfers and loan statements and credit reports. I could have sent every detail to Mom, to Dad, to our cousins and the family group chat that never included me unless someone needed help planning a birthday. I could have burned his reputation down to the dirt and salted the earth it stood on. But I hadn't. I hadn't said a word to anyone. And somehow, that silence had become the loudest thing in his life. Karen asked me then, more gently than I thought she was capable of, if there was anything I could do to help just this once, just to give the kids a chance to stay warm through the month, maybe keep them in school without another interruption. She didn't beg. She didn't promise repayment. She didn't even justify Kyle's behavior anymore. She just asked. I looked at her for a long time. I remembered all the holidays I spent alone because I didn't want to burden anyone. All the times I'd smiled through family dinners where Kyle got to be the charming, broke hero and I was the distant, unmarried sister who never quite fit in. I thought about every dollar I sent in silence, every favor I did without recognition, and every night I'd lied awake wondering what was wrong with me for caring so much about people who treated me like an afterthought. And then I said no. Not out of cruelty. Not even out of anger. I said no because for the first time in my life, I finally understood that helping people who refuse to help themselves isn't generosity, it's self-harm dressed up in a family sweater. Karen didn't argue. She stood up slowly, wiped her face, and before walking out the door, she whispered something under her breath that stopped me cold. He said if you ever cut him off, he'd find a way to ruin you. I think he meant it. And then she left. She left me standing in my own living room, alone, wondering just how far Kyle was willing to go now that the game had changed, and he wasn't holding any of the cards anymore. But what he didn't know, what none of them knew, was that I wasn't just cutting them off. I was planning something. And when it landed, it wouldn't just even the score. It would make sure Kyle never dared to speak my name with that smirk on his face again. There's a very specific moment, a narrow sliver of time that wedges itself between betrayal and clarity, where you stop being the person they depended on and start becoming the person they regret underestimating. And standing alone in my living room after Karen's quiet warning, after the door clicked shut behind her like punctuation on a chapter one hadn't yet finished reading, I realized I had finally arrived in that moment. It didn't feel like triumph, and it certainly didn't feel like closure, but it was a kind of awakening, a subtle but undeniable shift in the center of gravity, as if, for the first time, I was no longer orbiting Kyle's chaos, but watching it from a safe and calculated distance, making notes, drawing lines, planning moves. I didn't sleep that night. Not because of anxiety or regret, those had already been wrung out of me months ago, back when I started the slow withdrawal from a family that had mistaken my silence for weakness, but because something deeper had begun to stir in me, Something long buried beneath years of being the reliable one, the good daughter, the ever-available, ever-accommodating older sister who absorbed every emotional punch with a forced smile and a checkbook. That night, I sat at my desk until the sun cracked the horizon, going through boxes of old files, saved emails, and digital bank statements, pulling every shred of documentation that proved just how entangled my financial identity had become with Kyle's life, an identity he'd borrowed, stretched, and abused so thoroughly that I began to wonder where he ended and I began. I found the first real proof of his deception around 4 in the morning, a loan application dated 6 months ago with my name, my address, and a forged digital signature that matched one I'd used years earlier when I helped him refinance the house. It was subtle, almost clever, the kind of thing someone desperate and cornered might attempt, praying no one ever looked too closely. The loan wasn't massive, just under $5,000, but the principle of it, the violation, the audacity of using my identity as a fallback plan while simultaneously calling me a failure in front of our family, ignited a fire in me that no apology could hope to extinguish. This wasn't just misuse. It was theft, plain and simple. But more than that, it was a confirmation of what I'd refused to admit for far too long. Kyle didn't just rely on me. He counted on my silence, my shame, and my unwillingness to disrupt the family's carefully curated illusion of harmony. What Kyle had never understood, what he still didn't seem to grasp even now that his financial lifeline had been severed, was that I had learned how to live without him long before he learned how to live without me. I'd spent years building my life on the periphery of the family, never quite center stage, never quite acknowledged, but always observing, always absorbing, always remembering who said what, who did what, and who turned their head when the truth became inconvenient. And while he partied his way through his 20s and stumbled into his 30s with a string of jobs he barely held and friendships he used up like tissues, I had quietly built something solid, a reputation, a savings account, a sense of self-worth that no longer depended on their validation. Still, I knew better than to strike back recklessly. Revenge, if it was going to mean anything at all, had to be precise, measured, and above all else, undeniable. So I started crafting a plan, not out of vindictiveness, but out of a cold, steady need to reset the balance, to finally rewrite the story in which I was no longer the supporting character in Kyle's mess, but the author of my own ending. The first step was contacting a lawyer, not for litigation, not yet, but for consultation, to understand what my legal exposure might be given the forged signature and the potential fallout if that loan defaulted. The second step was reaching out to the credit agencies and placing a fraud alert on my file, followed by a painstaking review of every account I'd ever opened, co-signed, or backed for Kyle or Karen. By the end of the week, I'd compiled a folder thick enough to sink a coffee table. It included itemized lists, notarized statements, and screen captures of every transaction, every transfer, every quietly paid bill that kept their world spinning while they treated me like a footnote. I didn't send it to the family yet. Not because I was afraid, but because I wanted to give Kyle a choice, an opportunity, one final window, to face what he'd done and take responsibility before I burned every bridge he had left. So I sent him a message. It was long, careful, and devoid of emotion. It laid out exactly what I'd found, what I'd done, and what I would do if he didn't come clean, not to me, but to the family, to our parents, to Karen, and maybe most importantly, to himself. I gave him 48 hours. Not a minute more. He responded in less than 4. But not with the apology I expected. Not with any acknowledgement of the fraud, or the betrayal, or the years of deception. Instead, he wrote, "You want to destroy me? Fine. But don't pretend you're better. You liked being needed. You made yourself indispensable so you could feel superior. You cut us off to punish us, not to heal yourself." It wasn't a confession. It was a dare. And that was when I realized something crucial, something that explained every snide remark, every diminishing joke, every casual dismissal he'd thrown my way over the years. Kyle didn't hate me for walking away. He hated me because I had the strength to do it. Because deep down, he knew he would never have the courage to face what I had faced, to stand alone and still survive, to carry the weight without asking for applause. History, in families like ours, repeats not because people forget, but because they're too afraid to change. They cling to roles that feel familiar, even if those roles slowly suffocate them, because anything else feels like betrayal. But I had betrayed nothing. I had honored the truth. I had finally stepped out of the pattern. And I was no longer afraid of being the villain in someone else's story. Because the real villain had just made his final move. The strange thing about final acts, those moments that wrap up the unraveling of a story you've spent years pretending wasn't being written, is that they rarely come with the drama or the fireworks you might expect, and often arrive in silence, steady and unassuming. Like snowfall on the morning after a storm, soft enough to be overlooked but weighty enough to bury everything that came before. By the time I stepped out of my car on Christmas morning, the sky above Kyle's neighborhood was slate gray, the air dense with that familiar winter heaviness that seemed to slow everything down, muting sound and softening the edges of things, which, in hindsight, felt perfectly appropriate. I wasn't there to make a scene or to shout. I wasn't there to gloat or to take back what was already gone. I was there to deliver a final gesture, one I had spent weeks preparing and one that I knew would slice sharper than any confrontation or accusation ever could. I walked up the front steps without hesitation, without dread, without even the bitter aftertaste of resentment that had so often colored my thoughts during the many years I'd spent quietly financing Kyle's delusions of confidence. There was no joy in me, no smugness, no righteous glow that people like to believe comes with taking the high road. I wasn't interested in taking the high road. I was interested in the true road, the one lined with facts, consequences, and a clarity I had earned the hard way. And in my hand, in a plain brown envelope that bore no signature or decoration, was the sum of that clarity, copies of financial statements, a notarized report from my attorney confirming fraudulent activity tied to Kyle's name, and a carefully written letter addressed to our parents, explaining, not accusing, not indicting, simply explaining how deeply this pattern had stretched over the years, and how quietly I had absorbed it. I didn't knock. I didn't need to. Through the window I could already see movement, Christmas morning in full swing, crumpled wrapping paper on the floor, the soft glow of tree lights blinking against beige walls, Karen in a housecoat holding a coffee mug with both hands like she was bracing herself for something she knew couldn't be delayed much longer. The kids were on the floor, laughing at something on the television. Kyle wasn't in view yet, but I knew he was there. I stepped up to the porch, paused for just a moment, not out of doubt, but out of habit, and then slid the envelope into the mail slot and turned back toward the driveway, already hearing footsteps inside as someone approached the door. He opened it before I reached the bottom step. "Rachel," he said, his voice thick with sleep or perhaps the weight of a reality he was no longer able to ignore. "What is this?" I turned and looked at him, not like a sister, not like the fixer or the fallback or the family disappointment he'd tried to reduce me to over the years, but like a woman who had finally chosen herself, who had finally stopped asking for permission to matter. "It's everything you pretended didn't exist," I said. "And I'm done pretending." He held the envelope loosely, as though unsure whether to open it or burn it, but I knew he would read every page, not because he wanted to, but because he had to, because this was the moment he would finally be forced to see the story from the outside, stripped of the filters and the excuses and the lazy rewrites he'd used to protect his ego. "You're really doing this on Christmas?" he asked, but there was no anger in his voice this time, just a kind of hollow awe, like he was watching a bridge collapse and realizing too late that it had always been the only path back to safety. "I didn't choose the day," I said. "You did last year, when you decided I wasn't good enough to be part of your version of family." He didn't reply. For the first time in my life, Kyle had nothing to say, and that silence was louder than any argument we could have had. I walked back to my car and drove away, not looking in the rearview mirror, not wondering whether he'd call, or cry, or crumble, because none of it mattered anymore. My story, the one I'd spent too long living in the shadows of, wasn't his to narrate anymore. And the beauty of finally reclaiming your story is that you no longer owe anyone a version of it that makes them feel comfortable. That afternoon, While the rest of the city buzzed with joy and glitter and the artificial warmth of social media perfection, I sat alone on my couch, sipping cider and watching the snow begin to fall through the wide, uncurtained window of my living room. No family, no children opening presents, no chaos or laughter or emotional noise, just quiet. And for the first time in years, it wasn't the lonely kind of quiet. It was the clean kind. The earned kind. The kind that follows a storm you've spent years pretending wouldn't come. Later that evening, my phone lit up with a string of messages I didn't open. One from my mother, short and likely stunned, probably trying to wrap her head around the facts laid out in my letter. One from Karen, who had been quiet since the last time we spoke, but who now seemed to understand that I had only ever wanted truth, not revenge, not praise, just truth. And one from Kyle, sent at exactly 11:47 p.m., reading only, "You got what you wanted. Merry Christmas." But that was where he was still wrong. I hadn't gotten what I wanted. Because what I had wanted for years was never retribution. It was never control or exposure or the upper hand. What I had wanted was acknowledgement, fairness, a sliver of decency that said, "We see you. We value you. We respect what you've given us." And what I had finally accepted was that they were never going to give me that. So I gave it to myself. I turned off my phone, stood at the window, and watched the snow fall in complete silence. Not mourning anything. Not expecting anything. Just existing. And that, after all the years of waiting for someone else to make me feel like enough, was the most powerful ending I could have written. Because sometimes the best revenge isn't about making them hurt. It's about finally choosing not to let them hurt you anymore.